Assalamu alaikum, everyone. What could be better than receiving a book like this as a gift? And I have to say, it's one of my favorite books that I've pulled out to read again. Welcome to EduTour's live chat session number 24. This is Jugalbandi series number 7 with Gardner, and here she is. I'm just going to bring her on board. Yes. Voila. Hope you're all well and staying safe and under quarantine conditions and wearing your masks and gloves.
There we go. Hello, everybody. Hello.
So this is my book today.
What's the title? Can't read it.
Yeah, you'll enjoy this. It's called Understanding Power.
Oh.
Chomsky.
Yeah.
Noam Chomsky.
Yes.
So,
good.
So this is what I've been reading today. And I'm not sure if that's a good sign or not.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering. What does it mean?
What does it mean that I'm reading Chomsky's Understanding Power? But this is an incredible book, and he's an incredible man, and it's incredible stuff to read. So how are you doing? Good afternoon.
How am I doing? How can you ask me that right at the very beginning on a day like this?
I know.
It's, I think it's a very extraordinary day on the earth. And we certainly didn't plan that it would be.
No.
So I'm taking a deep breath, and I'll let you introduce what we're going to be doing, and then we're off.
Okay, so I'm saying hello to everyone who's here. Habiba is here. There's some other familiar friends. Faiza is here. Farrukh is here. Lovely to see you all. This is really nice. I'm always happy to see familiar faces. Thank you so much for continuing to join our conversations and for contributing in the DMs. We do take those ideas and opinions into account and roll with the punches. I'm not sure. I think most of you don't know, but Jean knows that I had an interesting weekend because in the middle of the pandemic globally, losing lives to the virus, losing lives to poor governance, losing lives to the human ego's century-old differentiation between color and gender and race, etc. So it's all coming to the surface, and there are different types of deaths happening. So there's physical deaths of people, but there's also cultural death happening and philosophical and visceral. So there's all sorts of things collapsing and falling apart. And every time a structure falls, it makes room for something new to grow. It makes room for something to come out. So however tragic it is in some cases that people are dying and that things are collapsing, on the other side, it's things that are collapsing and being brought down that have been on the precipice of being brought down for a long time. And some people say that the liberal moderates have been keeping that edge condition alive, and now it's gone over the edge. So peculiarly enough, I was in Makli. In the middle of all of this, I went to a UNESCO World Heritage Site, which is the largest necropolis for saints and kings. So it's a giant cemetery, but also a spiritual sanctuary. So there's people who come there who believe in the saints, and they will do their rituals and offerings. And it's a really interesting space for me because it's this massive graveyard that is home to the dead. That's what a necropolis is. It's a city of the dead. And it's also the space that was the mother for my concept creation. The idea for the EduTours began while I was at Makli 8 years ago, exactly this time in June, in the sweltering heat. And I went back in the sweltering heat on Saturday to revisit this project's mother, so to speak. And even though it's an environment that houses the dead, contrary to that belief, I think it's very alive. It was a great rejuvenating experience for me to go back and be given life again through all the confusion of what's happening in the world, trying to figure out what we're doing in terms of the new directions, in terms of pedagogical reframing, new paradigms. And it's amazing to actually go to the ancient dead and look through them for direction and come back from them with a completely new, invigorated, rejuvenated sense of life, um, which brought me a lot of peace. It was just really wonderful to spend the day in the middle of this overt silence, but in fact, this innate symphony of energy and um, these open arms that take you in and then make you one and remind you of where it all began and where you came from and send you back saying, you know, shabash, onward, westward ho, here's your food, here's your drink, here are your fresh clothes, be off with you, child. So, you know, it's that sort of a sense to go home and get freshened up and be sent back out again. So that's going to be my strange introduction for today. And our topic in any case is mapping architecture and life and death. So I think it's almost on point that I happen to be at Muckley. For those who haven't been, I hope you get a chance to travel with me one day. But if not, please look it up. It's a UNESCO World Heritage Site. It's 400 years of architectural history from the 14th century to the 18th. 4 different dynasties that ruled in the area have their kings, noblemen, saints buried there. It's an incredibly magical place, regardless of what's happening in the world. As time stops still, Muckley continues to live. It's magical.
Well, the magic is so extraordinary. Mapping. So today, mapping architecture of life and death. You find yourself in the city of the dead and you get rejuvenated. You claim life. And mapping, if that's what you and I are doing right now, trying to form a structure that is the architecture of life and death. A map is a structure. It's subjective. We both know this. But of course, I went to look at the word architecture. So while you were in the city of the dead, I was in digging among sounds. Rummaging in the attic of how this word came to be. And everyone knows that translations offer you many, many choices of what word you will choose in your language as the meaning of an ancient sound. So architecture, art, A-R-C-H, we know it as archetype. And what I choose is the meaning that's come over time along the Indo-European travel routes of the beginning of form making. So the sense that, like an archetype, it's the beginning of a form. And then texture. Tech means the weaver, the maker, the fabricator. And it also means context. So I find that very provocative, because we tend to think of architecture and the architect as if it was a single person. But if the weaver is also the context, then that leads me to the idea of a collective. And at this point, like you described, it's the collective of the human on the earth. And what form are we going to make? Are we going to make another necropolis where the dead can be honored? but we're burying our dead in plastic and without any ceremony. So when you get to life and death, the new form, the context after this last, since the beginning, since George Floyd was murdered by the police, the people who are protecting the polis, the city. At that moment, it was as if enough was enough. And it wasn't just in New York City or the big metropolises of the United States or even the small towns. It was all over the earth. And it's a little hard for me to talk about this, but the sense that people had it. No more killing, standing on somebody's neck until they can't breathe. What has happened to all of us? And people come pouring out into the streets, especially in the United States, where the militarized police were attacking them. And the man who leads this country sent the National Guard into the capital of this country and called troops into the region around the District of Columbia. I mean, think of what that means in terms of people still marched, people still said no peacefully. So today, the National Guard withdrew from Washington, D.C., and the active troops were sent back. So what can we say? It makes a difference when you become the architect of life and death, because that's where we are. This little virus that has, you know, all sorts of names, but everybody knows it's here. It's not our enemy. It's part of a biological microbiome of protozoa and fungi and bacteria that makes life possible. But because we, the human species, and then I point to myself as a white person, have somehow said we're superior, we're fighting against the basis of life. These little bacteria, these little fungi, these little microorganisms, and their whole job is stability. And we've upset the stability by declaring ourselves, and now I say the human species in general, as superior. So we're going to manipulate the soils, the air, the water, and death is staring us all in the face around the entire earth. So what is it? Life or death? No, it's your turn, Zen. You can take the ball. I throw it to you at not an easy moment.
I know.
I know. And
Not,
I'm only laughing out of relief. Yay, Zen, take it.
Not fair. Not
fair. That's reciprocity, back and forth.
Jugalbandi. So
yes, Jugalbandi, exactly.
So, you know, history of human evolution every so often will gesture at the idea that the white man was not always white. The roots of the white man's facial structure and skin tone have evolved because of where they ended up settling and how our skin color adjusts to where we live and the temperature and the climate. So that whiteness is, as we know, nothing for me to say. It's entirely irrelevant and acontextual to anything. But where the question comes in is that in all the systems of the world, how is it that certain systems seemed like good opportunities to exploit, to take from others, to enslave others? And by enslave, I mean not only enslave physically, but enslaved culturally, enslaved by taking away their history from them, enslaved by giving them an educational system that was clerical, enslaved by hashing through their religious beliefs and their faiths and the spiritual. So there's been a systemic, organized history of crime, which I think goes beyond and before capitalism. Today's results, of course, are the grand finale, the crescendo is capitalism falling apart and democracy up for question. But you and I both know that there were systems that worked, that weren't color conscious way before. And this is back to my interest, is our ancient ancestors had systems that worked, and they have been junked en route. We talked about this, and Shah Jahan mentioned it in his conversation, that I will come back to this, that we spoke about, but we skirted around it and never came back. I wonder if at the end of the day, the written, printed, mass-produced books have a role to play in this systemic control. Because the cultures that didn't write in terms of mass reproduction, they wrote. They had their notes, they had the hieroglyphics, but because they didn't go into the mass reproduction of those texts, we didn't have the ability to mass brainwash millions of people with this knowledge encased in these books.
Yes.
A book that promises to tell me what understanding power is. I'm not sure that I need a book to tell me what understanding power is.
Yes.
Because if you have felt that knee on your neck, you don't need a book to tell you what the problem is. And the Reverend Al Sharpton, I was watching a speech that he's done recently on this, and he beautifully moves across the different genres and scales of knee on the neck. So although the trigger point may have been the murder of George Floyd, across the world, the colonial history, the imperialist history, the takeover of land, is all about control and power and demeaning somebody and bringing them down. You and I talk about making sure that we are inclusive about the black and white in life, like the yin yang. We should be inclusive about life and death. Both are equally important, and we must embrace both. I understand that. But that is an equation that we have, through the millennia, not been made to believe. We've been made to believe life is better than death. One color is better than the other. One gender is better than the other. There's always been this systemic establishment of the institute of competition, that unless there isn't a winner and a loser, the game doesn't exist. And war comes out of this, takeover of land, takeover of culture. My book is better than your book. There's always this competitive, my skin is better than you, my height is better than yours, my body is better than yours. I mean, it's like, not like, it is. The books, I believe, have institutionalized this. If we were to imagine life without books, funny thing, for instance, Gene, it's not meant to be trite, but it may sound trite. So I was watching in all my films, sci-fi films that I've been attracted to sort of magnetically, I picked up a film on Shakespeare's Macbeth. We've all read Macbeth. Every Pakistani child who's done English, Pakistani, Indian, Bangladeshi, probably Nepalese, most likely Afghani, every child who has done any kind of English education has been through Macbeth and King Lear and Midsummer Night. And I watched it the other day and I thought, wait a second, what is it that I'm supposed to learn from this? I can recite Macbeth back to you. Our brief candle lights, but I can recite it all back. I've memorized it. The Three Witches, etc. I thought, this is absurd. Why do we have to be taught this? It is so far flung from cultural context. And so much about understanding the Scots and the Brits and their incest and their mindsets and their mentality towards witchcraft and the lack of belief in something that could potentially be something that would take the rug out from underneath them. So they call it witchcraft and it's sent into sort of demonic genre and ignored or burnt at the stake. And you think, what is this nonsense? Why are our children made to suffer this? So that's, for me, that's again a knee on the neck. We should have been celebrating our own literature and literature from the region. There's nothing in Macbeth or King Lear or Midsummer Night's Dream that now as I look at it, it just seems so barbaric and irrelevant, because the time that those stories are set in, when you come to the Indian subcontinent at that same time, the culture is extremely different. The quality of poetry is much more sophisticated. Their clothing, their jewelry, their understanding of art, music, and literature. They had musicians who mythology tells us would play music that would make it rain or would make water move, make glass shatter. True or not true, that's not what Shakespeare was telling us. I want to hear more of those stories. What is that music? What is that frequency? What is that instrument? What is the connection between the vocal cords and that instrument to make water move and rain come down? That for me is life. So I think that the knee on the neck is a condition that, as Reverend Al Sharpton said, they've suffered for 401 years in the US. But across the globe, at the hands of the French and the Spanish and the Brits and the Portuguese, millions of people. What has happened in Myanmar recently with the Rohingya Muslims? And for me personally, aside from all of this, what about the knee on the neck of nature? What about the orangutans who lost their forest because of palm oil or deforestation? What about the koalas? What about the Serengeti, the animals that are slaughtered for their horns? This is all human extravagance, and it's all connected to that knee on the neck where we believe we are better. That is a fundamental issue. Is you and I talk about inclusivity, but the world is not interested in inclusivity. They're interested in saying, I'm better than you. X is better than Y. Y is better than Z. So the new paradigm, the new shift that will potentially come out of many of us who are getting as moved as you on a daily basis will also bring us to a point where we will push ourselves off that precipice and say, enough of being emotionally harvested. And how do we put all this back together? Because it needs to come back in an inclusive manner. Rida says something really wonderful. You know, Rida Arif is in Europe, I believe. Rida, are you in Belgium? Someplace exotic like Northern Europe. As a Pakistani, it's embarrassing for me to be so disconnected with the literature of my own country and its spectacular history. So this is brilliant because this is an acknowledgement. We start with that acknowledgement. So once we've defined that there is a problem that's not sufficient, then we can go back and find the material to fill in. So here's a horse, in a sense. She's in Vienna, Austria. Thank you, Rida. Thank you. I'm sorry I forgot about that. So all of that was part of that need, the British colonial need on the subcontinent's neck. The murders that took place, the loot, they're talking about the protesters and the looting happening. Talk about the material that was looted from India, from this whole region. And that's still modern. So there were looters that came before, and there were looters that came before. It's nothing new. Indochine was looted. All the rubber plantations, how were those people treated? By the French. So all of these people, all those artifacts sitting at the Metropolitan Museum, at the British Museum in London, at the museum in Berlin, that is not of that land. How did it get there? All of Egypt's treasures. There are Gandhara treasures from Pakistan, which are sitting up there in those museums on display. How did they get there? So, the inclusivity of life and death as one, they're flip sides of the same coin. There's moments that we die every day, we suffocate at frustrating thoughts of what's happening to the planet. Those animals who have done nothing to us, who've asked us for nothing, who've taken nothing from us. We've taken their lands. We talk about taking lands from here by the Brits and lands from the Vietnamese by the French and the Portuguese in Sri Lanka and the Spaniards and yada, yada, yada. But what about the land that we continue to steal from the animals? And then when that deer crosses the highway, we shoot it. It's on its own land. That road is going through its land. We are trespassing. And yet, that deer loses its life. So there's a complete anarchic collapse of the most fundamental unison between life and death as I'm looking at the news coming through every day. There are people in denial that this is temporary. Life and death is not temporary. It's daily, it's every minute, it's permanent. And that oscillation between life and death is its very permanence. That's what we celebrate. So as one thing rolls in, another rolls out. Then one rolls in, then another rolls out. The fact that we're not able to celebrate death by going through the proper rituals of closure, of burying the person's material existence is, to me, it's like nature mocking us for our egos and making us remember how small and irrelevant we are in the millennia that nature has been around before us. That she is now saying, you people think you're so cool. Guess what? You are nothing. And interestingly enough, Zen Buddhism, the first thing that one is taught in Zen Buddhism, the first thing ever, you pick up Suzuki's book and the first line on top says, nothing ever comes into existence and nothing ever goes out of existence. We have ignored the essence and materiality of nothingness because the ego has become very, very muscular and on way too many steroids. I'm going to quickly, while you think about that, Arida has another wonderful message. As a professional, sometimes I really wonder how to encourage people to explore their own history of Pakistan when most of its treasures are actually sitting in London, New York, and Paris. Absolutely. Well, they can start by coming on trips with me, Rida. We can start here and then figure out how to handle New York, London, and Paris, and Berlin in time.
Well, I certainly agree with that. And so much of what you said resonates very, very deeply. The rage that you're expressing, tremendously important to recognize it. What I feel is a tremendous pain, and the repression of pain. You are expressing the outrage and repression of the rage. But here in the Delaware River Valley and in New York, where I teach at the new school in the Hudson River Valley, we have the same phenomenon. The same repression of the original peoples, the Lenape, their artifacts in a museum, the recognition of place that we've been talking about as the beginning point, I think is tremendously important. The Earth is one planet with many places and many peoples evolving. We're all Earth sprouts and moving. The origin of the peoples on this continent, some of it comes from your part of the world. The sense that such horrific acts have been done in the name of greed and power. I think it's a moment, a decisive moment. Pandemics have caused slavery, and pandemics have caused new ways of being. There's nothing decided at this moment, except for the undeniable reality that this is the first pandemic that involves the entire Earth, and this is the first time the entire Earth in such numbers has risen up and said enough against power, greed, unilateral declaration that one gender or one color or one group of people are superior. So for me, it's tremendously important to stand with the murderers, not to create oppositions. That, I think, only takes us back. But we have to recognize our rage and our pain, and we can do it like you and I are doing it, talking, mapping, making sounds, and finding a way to map the sounds in your place, going and standing on the earth. Right near where I am in the Delaware Valley is a Lenape sacred spring. And almost every ancient culture that I know anything about, the Greeks at Delphi, the Hopis at the Sipapu, where the water comes out of the earth is the voice of the earth. And people have gone to these sacred places in the earth in the same way you described going to the necropolis. There are powerful places in each of our, what I call bioregions, the biological place. And we need to listen, which means silence and hearing. But we can't do that unless we don't recognize how we feel. And like my grandson, who's weeping outside because a baby bird has fallen out of a nest. And he wants to do a ritual, and he wants us to be out there when the dawn is coming up. He's only 9. We need to recognize he steps on an ant and he gets in tears. We are murderers, whatever scale we're talking about. And until we can stand with those people and realize that, you know, I have murderous instincts. I do not want to tell you for whom, but I know I need to recognize it. And I need to speak it, but I'm not going to speak it to inflame, like the brothers Karamazov, Dostoevsky. The older brother talks about killing the father. The younger brother kills because he takes it literally and he doesn't realize. So it's your whole thing about the printed word, I think, is extraordinarily important. Sound before that, and the way that people governed in a place, their culture was cultivating the sounds in the place as a way to communicate. They had to tell stories. They had to express themselves in ways that you could take into your body, because there was no printed word. There was nothing that said this story has to be memorized. It was resonant. It impacted your body. It was there on those sound vibrations that are beyond even my voice. So that when I speak, I'm speaking from the silence, from all those other species that we now know are communicating. And we have the responsibility, if we're the dominant species, the human species, to speak for them, not in our favor, and not because, as I mentioned, biologically we need them, but because they are being suppressed and repressed, like you have expressed, like I can express if I go back in my lineage and claim it. I've had dreams, because I teach architecture just like you practice it. I've had dreams about masons, master masons in Romania, what we call Romania now, where the master mason had to bury his wife alive in the foundation as part of the sacrifice for the building. And I could just go back through dreams where I think every one of us, if we claimed our place and not just isolated the Silk Route. I had my DNA done, but it started where it began. It began in Africa. It didn't begin in the Midwest, in the United States, began in Africa. So what you were saying about our skin colors. So I can't even remember what you were saying when you were silent, but I'm speaking in response, not reaction, in response, in the resonance, the sound that your words. And it is very upsetting to me to not even fully feel how angry you are and how much you've been colonized and you've fought through these layers till you realize you're the heir, the heritage of this place. And you're not taking people away, you're bringing the heritage into the present. I think this is tremendously important. We all have to claim our inheritance and realize that that's the diversity and the respect for each other that we need. We need all these voices, just like all the other animals need to be heard and respected.
You know, Jean, those buildings, I was at the necropolis. It's funny you should talk about sound. And they all want to be heard. I think our heritage buildings, yes, we need to reclaim our inheritance. There's no doubt about that. With respect to other people's inheritances around us, and have that grow, and in an understanding that we are all still connected. So it's not isolated inheritances. They're inheritances that are connected through blood with each other. They're cousins and second cousins and third cousins and fourth cousins. That it's all one giant family stemming from Africa to Montana. And then we have these great sort of journeys en route. And each of those journeys may have taken 1,000 years or 2,000 years, but if we follow that journey of evolution, maybe from Africa to Montana has taken you 50,000 years. And that would be the journey to follow. And stories that are revealed, and stories that are not in books, stories that need to be reclaimed. So when I was looking at these buildings, each of them speaks. Each of them has a different sound. Each of them has a different temperature, a different personality. And when I'm standing next to them, it's a really soothing feeling to know that I belong to this history, and that history belongs to me. So that duet for me was not, you can see the silence, but you can hear the excitement of them to see you again. And you've come to visit again, like grandparents who you haven't seen in months. And they all want to talk to you, and they all have stories, and they all have complaints about domestic help. And they all, they all want to talk to you. So for every time somebody asks me, you've gone back to Makli again, aren't you bored? Never. I'm never bored when I go back. Find something new. My ancestors have new stories to tell me. They have new anecdotes to share. They have new secrets about how much better life could be. Every time I go, they will guide, and they will inspire, and they will fuel my imagination. And I come back exhausted, but new. And there's a sound. And I was just, as I'm listening to you, we also have a lot of petroglyphs, carvings in stone, Shoka's time from the Gandhara lineage. And those pieces are incredible to look at, because here is somebody carving these incredible markings, figures, writing, calligraphy, stories into the rock, giant size into the rock. In a way, it's the same as creating these funerary sites or shrines, or these, because you're taking the stone and you're constructing a language. You're constructing an instrument that will speak. You're constructing an instrument that will sing. It's just that we are so blind and blinded by our education, blinded by the mass subconscious that's had its eyes poked out as part of that knee on the neck. This is the other thing that's happened. We've been blinded by design to look at these buildings and assume that they are just blocks stacked on top of each other like Lego, when in fact, they're entire living ecosystems. They're channels that talk, they're saxophones, they're guitars, they're rubabs, they're musical instruments that take you into a time of mythology and story and romance and poetry. And all of that belongs to me here and belongs to Rida. So I take people to see this and to enjoy it. How we reclaim it, how we do the same. What you and I are working on, I believe, is that we need to do this a similar listening and seeing, but seeing from here, not seeing from here. Because this site we've surrendered. We surrendered millennia ago to education. But this site is still intact, it's still pure, and the intuition is still alive. So if we can start seeing from here, from inside, get Afghanistan to see itself, get the Russians, get the Indians, get the Burmese, get the different African states, get the Moroccans and the Spaniards, get everybody to start seeing in a new manner, to start listening to sounds that we have been made to believe don't exist, or they've been drowned out by modernity's nonsensical noise and clutter. So if a cloud-like connection that's blurry and charcoaly and vibrating on its edges can bring people together and then have them go through each other and come back, and then go in a different direction and come back. So if it can be this cloud-like fuzzy elasticity, we talked about Brownian motion, to take this suppression, bring people out of this global suppression, global cultural suppression, that's beyond just what's happening now, but actually impacts and has affected different people in different places on the earth, human and animal, forever. That would be a great new direction, I believe.
Well, the earth does join these different places.
Oh, here we go. Sorry.
Yes, I was going to say, where'd he go? He disappeared. Guess what? I'm starting to talk. Yeah! Okay. All right.
Sorry.
That's how powerful I am. It wiped out. Okay.
I know.
So,
like, oops, God.
The earth does connect us. I mentioned about Delphi. I mentioned about the sea papus, places where the water comes out of the earth. So there are these underground channels. On the surface, we get the ancient Silk Route, the way in which we were connected on the surface, but underneath, the earth connects us through water. And it also connects us through energy. And that location of buildings that talk, like you described, where sound is in the form. They're on top of similar nexuses where water comes out in some places, and many buildings, like in New York City, St. John the Divine is on a spring. But there's an energy nexus. And that energy, the weaver, we now call it the architect, but I think it's so important. The weaver, they could be making with sound as chanting, as singing. They could be moving as dancers. The weaver on that place, Stonehenge, the pyramids, the temples, places that bring into form the energy of the earth. They have an underlying system, just like we all need water. Well, the geometry of those buildings that you saw, and you sent me pictures and I looked at others, those are forms, geometry, measuring the earth, forms that are have a numerical series in relationship to our living body. So there's no, absolutely, if you're quiet and are there in the building, you will feel, because your body is made on the same system. In the south of France, the churches, the shapes were made for the monks to walk through, and certain sounds coming, the sounds of silence, heard by those people who sat in silence and listened. So listening seems to me what was the gift that you gave Necropolis, the reason you feel rejuvenated, you're not alone. And the presence, the living presence of what we've banished, death, is the very reason that we're killing ourselves and the planet and every species. Like you said, death is part of life. And until we accept it, we'll be treating the earth and ourselves, which is what we've been talking about, treating each other as a resource, something to be mined, not living, but we're all a source of life. And this is this moment in time. And I'll end right on time, and you won't have a last word.
No, we have 10 more minutes.
Okay, go ahead. I saw you looking at the clock, and I was like, okay.
You can go on. We have time.
No. I'm throwing the ball back to you. I'm throwing it back.
So, it's really interesting how, the mapping discussion with Wendy, sort of technical conversation with Shahjahan and Mariam, it's since I've come back from Makli, it's overwhelming because you look at a space from a distance of a few years, or I was there a few months ago, we read about in books. But when one comes back and there's been an emotional conversation, it's more difficult to talk about it because I think that even now I'm still absorbing what happened and the new direction that they have advised me to go in. I got there at sunrise, which was incredible to see the dark blue of the sky lift, and these yellow sandstone buildings start glowing as the sun came up onto them. And then, of course, the heat kicked in. It was 33, 34 degrees, a little bit uncomfortable. But I think if you allow yourself to be guided by architectural heritage, history, and use them as boats through a river of time and just float. So it's just a canoe with a single oar to stop you from falling over, and you just keep going. And at some point, you may capsize, and that's okay, because you turn over and then you turn back over. So that capsizing will give you a different set of sounds through the water, and then you'll come back out, you shake your head like a dog, and you get back where you need to be. So regular capsizing is probably a good thing.
Yes.
Because it will keep your fear in check. I think we need to also do a mapping of the architecture of fear. What is this construct that these cages that we are made to live in through social norms, through governance systems, through religion, through educational systems, there is a fuel that fires everyone's fear. Today we were talking about a project of mine where there's an artist who's been commissioned to do a piece on a mural on the wall. And the brief he's been given is, can you make the mural look like the wall has been graffitied on, but also something that will incite others to come and scribble on it? So how do we break down the fear to not touch the wall? Don't touch the wall. No fingerprints, no light. We're taught this as children. And one of my memories of a childhood home I lived in before I started school, and before, certainly way before I even went to the UK, was I used to spend a lot of time drawing, coloring books, etc. So there was usually a crayon or a color pencil in my hand. And I remember pictures of my family home as a child, and they all had this like waves all across the walls, because I would just walk next to the wall with a different color in my hand over the course of the day. So these different lines, these watery lines at my height level are all over the house. And I remember my mother obviously getting really upset about it. Today, I'm trying to recreate the same experience as a commissioned piece of art. What was childlike and naive and not in a sketchbook or in a confined piece of paper. My entire house where I lived was my canvas.
Well, fear, a map of fear, and the child who is boxed by those who love them to keep them safe. And then later, the doctrinaire teaching in our institutions. The South African leader, Nelson Mandela, after 27 years in prison, one of the first things that he said when he came out is, we all are afraid.
Yes.
So that's a beginning. The fear that is in all of us now, the climate emergency, the pandemic, the racism, the police violence, we're all afraid. Courage is to look at that fear and go through it. That's, I think, where we are right now. Not, yes, recognize what's happened, but don't let it become fear. Let us go through it. That to me is what spontaneous action means. The body is has wisdom that goes back to all these places. And if we can rekindle that wisdom, we'll go right through it. Like you said, the boat tips over and you bob right up again.
Yes. And
yes. Is a school bell gonna ring and Instagram is gonna say class is over?
Class is over. I know. But
talk about frames.
So we have to go back to Wendy and think about more ways of creating maps, more mapping that's of the positive and the negative integrated, so we don't make one mutually exclusive of the other.
Yes.
So on that note, back to the drawing board.
Yes.
Thank you very much, Jean, once again for your time. Thank you, Sarah, Nada, Farokh, everyone who's joined us today, Hamza, Gaia. Amazing conversation. Thank you both for being here, now facing the truth. Wendy, thank you. We've just mentioned you. You'll have a long life. So on all of you soon. Thank you so much. Khuda Hafiz from Karachi. Jean, look after yourself. Please stay safe, all of you in New York and anywhere else. Mask, gloves, whenever possible. Bless you all. Thank you so much. Khuda Hafiz.